coming from the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation is a US foundation that's been around for 80 years and operates in 10 countries around the world and in Southern Africa. I am speaking from that perspective around the need for philanthropy, but also offering some critique around what we should be cautious of as we think about African philanthropy. Firstly, to just go to a point that Una made earlier around the meaning of philanthropy, I think the language that we use around philanthropy is important. The importance of what we've been practicing within Africa since time immemorial, community to community. Like, I grew up in a township where you gave and helped those that needed help within the community. It wasn't about a high net worth individual coming to save you from your poverty. And I think the notion of the poor being able to help each other is something that we have a rich history of that. And I also think the meaning of philanthropy has evolved in a way that it's become very distorted to be about money and the distribution of money. The meaning of philanthropy, the word, is the love of humanity, the love of humankind. It's not about money, and it's not about the distribution of money. It's really about being connected and solidarity and mutuality between people. And because of your love of humanity, you rooting your intervention in love. And so I think the framing around the rich giving to the poor has the potential harm of being patronizing and paternalistic in our approach then, where we start approaching philanthropy from a savior complex, where we're out to save those that are poorer than us, darker than us, and it also leads to us saying we know better because of the money that we're giving. I like using the frame of love when we talk about philanthropy because I think there's some inherent contradictions in love. If you think about a love relationship that you've had, relationships can lead to intense dependence on your partner. It can lead to where you give up yourself, you get subsumed into the other. There's an assimilation and a loss of autonomy. It can be emotionally destructive. And I think that mutual codependence that we have in relationships, we know, where there's self-sacrifice or expressions of egos engaged in relationships, those are harmful. And so I think it's useful for us to think about that when we think about the kind of philanthropy we practice, whether it's trying to turn our partners into ourselves and assimilate them into ourselves, whether it's about them sacrificing all autonomy and agency, whether it's to create intense dependence. And so I think love and the love of humanity is a very useful frame, but knowing that there's a contradiction there in terms of power. And I think when we talk about philanthropy, we have to talk about power. Dependence and power come into play. And so the kind of philanthropy that we want to be thinking through, if we want to disrupt notions of African philanthropy, we really need to disrupt those notions of power and go back to notions of love and dignity for people. So I think what are the implications in terms of the way we frame programs? I think when we start framing our programs from the concept of we know best and philanthropy knows best, it does lead us to becoming much more obsessed with solving problems. So philanthropy has in recent years, and I say this having been in the space for many years, become very obsessed with solving problems, as if we are going to solve the intractable problems of the world, and that giving money is going to solve that problem. And so we develop 5-year plans, we develop theories of change, and no matter how noble those intentions may be, it's never on its own going to solve the problems in society. Philanthropy on its own can never do that. And we can never work in a way that renders recipients invisible and disempowered and without agency. I think people ask before, where are the people? So when we're trying to solve problems on behalf of communities, are we going in and saying, we think the problem is HIV in this community? Or are we asking communities what the problems are? Infant mortality may be the biggest issue, but yet we're going to throw $10 million at HIV because we think HIV is the problem. And from our perspective, we think that's the problem and we're going to go and help that community. So we render communities invisible in that kind of environment where who frames the agenda, who decides which problems to solve, are very much driven around our internal needs of our organizations, philanthropists, high net worth individuals, sitting and deciding amongst themselves or with the board of directors what that agenda should look like. And I think this brings me to the question around accountability. I think we've all been talking about the regulatory framework. We need to make sure that we create an environment that's conducive for philanthropy, but I also want to throw a challenge out around accountability. To whom is philanthropy accountable? Are we accountable downwards to communities? Are we accountable to boards? Are we accountable to ourselves because it's our money and we know what's best? I think we really need to think about that if we want to disrupt the practice of philanthropy and not follow in the footsteps of the global north as Africa thinks about philanthropy. I think that the last point that I want to make in terms of government relationships and private philanthropy, I think this is another issue around accountability. Philanthropy can't be disrupting government and displacing government's role. Philanthropy is not government, but there is room for partnership with government, and there should be room for partnership, but that partnership should not displace. We know some philanthropists have money that exceeds the budget of some states or the ministries of health in some countries. There's a potential there for philanthropy to displace and disrupt a mandate that government gets from an electoral process. And at a time when democracy is in the decline, we really need to think about how we interact with democracy and governments and philanthropy. I think there is a space for partnership, but a partnership that really knows the role of government versus the role of philanthropy, versus the role of the development partners, versus the role of international agencies like a US foundation operating within Africa. We need to be taking our cue from those that know what their needs are, that set the agenda within this context, or are we taking our cues as international donors from boards sitting in headquarters in the global north, for example? I think that as we rethink partnership models, we need to rebuild partnerships, and we can really disrupt the very notion of partnership in trying to think through more creative ways of partnering with local philanthropy, with the private sector, with US foundations who have a different way of working. I think there's space for a diversity of perspectives, from horizontal community philanthropy to the philanthropy that US foundations do in Africa, to local philanthropy. How does that diversity come together into a melting pot that really respects and goes back to principles of Ubuntu, principles of love, of humanity, and where we hold each other accountable and really try to solve problems collectively and make sure we cede more of our power? I think to really do this effectively, we're all going to have to get a bit uncomfortable and start giving up some of the power that we hold in terms of how we spend our money. And that's probably going to be hard, but it will be exciting if all of us in this room started to really ask ourselves the hard questions around power. I want to talk about specifically private institutional philanthropy. Yes, we need philanthropy, but more importantly, we need philanthropic practice on the continent to be different. This quote from a recent research is just one small illustration of that. What this research and other work is pointing to is that we need a fundamental transformation in the foundations underlying our philanthropic practice. And today I want to touch on just a few of those foundational elements. The first is the need to focus on dignity being the determinant of relationships rather than accountability. The feedback we're getting is that when we start with accountability, as a determinant for relationships, it becomes about certainty, it becomes about control, it becomes about predetermining what we as philanthropy think is going to happen, but in contexts that are fluid and constantly evolving, and which we actually have no control over. When we start with accountability, it places us, the funder, as the center of the equation. Yes, it's our money, well, not always ours, but ultimately it's not about our lives, and we have to put that at the front and center. The alternative people are saying is, can we start with dignity as the determinant of relationships? And this calls for us to act in ways
that are fundamentally different. It calls for a rethink of the ways in which we engage with those who benefit from our support, but it also calls us to rethink how we see the purpose of our money. It calls for us to place our money in service of that which enables people to live their lives with dignity and freedom. And that means moving away from narrow targets and measurable outcomes and strategic footprints that have been developed somewhere totally isolated from people who are living the experience every day. But to ask the larger and harder questions about those we seek, what do those we seek to serve need from our money? And accountability can always be tailored around that. It's not about saying accountability is not an issue, it's about saying accountability to who and where does accountability sit within this framework. In the words of one of the respondents in this research, he said, the way in which philanthropy behaves with us is about teaching us to be good little boys and girls. And I thought it was a really strong indictment. The second thing that I want to talk about, the potential for us to be different on, is the need to put function before form. So as institutional philanthropy, we like to fund those that are in our mold. They're institutionalized, they have high-profile boards, they have top-down systems of management and governance, they're orderly, they're predictable, and they're very often risk-averse. We talk about NGOs and formalized civil society, rather than the broader civic space that is working towards advancing justice. When Halima started his opening remarks, he talked about how the landscape of how change is happening on this continent is so very different, and the ways in which movements are disrupting the civic space. But yet philanthropy has lagged far behind. We haven't caught up with the circumstance. We haven't figured out how do we engage with movements as part of our larger system of funding. We put movements and formalized civil society organizations against each other in our own internal frameworks. We say NGOs and academia are good. Social movements and community organizing, they're too unpredictable, they're too unorganized, they're too unaccountable, or they're too organic to fund. Or if we do fund them, we want to change them into a form that we can relate to. And this is really problematic. So when we plan our theories of change and our structural change frameworks, without taking into account what other forms of civic action are doing, and what that means for those who we do actually fund, what they can and can't do, this becomes difficult. Using institutional form as a criteria for funding means that we are only looking at one tiny spectrum of what civil society encompasses, and one slice of a much bigger pie that enables and is taking forward transformation. We need to rethink what are the changes we want to see in relation to the kind of substance, practice, and actions that enable these changes. So it's not about are we supporting NGOs, are we supporting CBOs, are we supporting movements. It's about what are they doing, what's the practice on the ground, what's needed to happen, and then think about what does a holistic approach to supporting change mean for us, irrespective of institutional form. We need to find ways for our money to support even that which does not fall within our bureaucratic requirements, not expect for them to transform into orderly, well-oiled machines that will be showcased. The last potential I think I want to talk about is the need or the potential for us to use power to build power. We have an enormous level of power, and we often try to hide it or hide from it. When what people are saying is, put your power on the table, let's be honest. You know, you come here with a very different dynamic. We're not equal. Let's recognize that and then have the conversation from there. But we need a very different level of introspective honesty about what our power means and what we want it to do versus the potential of what our power actually can do. If we start to shift who's at the table, if we start to shift who's making decisions, and if we start to shift who's changing the agenda. Too often our power is meant control, sometimes in forthright ways, but often in very insidious ways. Control over grantees and their work, control over agendas, control over parameters, control over whether it's environment versus HIV/AIDS versus orphans. And there's a sense of security and comfort in thinking that we can plan and control and predict, yet we know it's an illusion. So the potential of the power we hold is vastly underutilized and can be used in so many positive ways. We tend to speak about power in absolute terms, but it's not a zero-sum game. So can we change the framework reference to ask, what does it mean for our power to translate into solidarity rather than control? And ultimately, how can our philanthropic power be used to build the power of others? Thank you.
Susan did some work. She wrote a paper on the 12 philanthropists So I thought, besides telling us about what you do in the philanthropy space, you can also tell us a bit about the findings of the paper.
I'll just touch briefly on some of the interesting findings of the research. And one of the key things we found is that there's really a set of rules of the game. There's a way that people give, a way that we ask, the way that a need is seen, and there's a whole process and protocol. And while these rules aren't written down, they're widely understood. And so in that sense, they are actually institutionalized. They've evolved over time, and people trust in them and adapt them to the local context. So just before I go on, what is community philanthropy? Just so we all have a common understanding. And community philanthropy really involves community members working together and leveraging community resources to better address challenges or to improve the quality of life in the community. And it's a collaborative method of development that emphasizes building internal assets, capacities, and trust through participation in shared power and decision-making for a common good. And in our work, our team came up with two types of community philanthropy, what we call horizontal philanthropy and what we call vertical philanthropy. And horizontal philanthropy is that type of giving among and between people within a community. So for example, among and between the poor. And this is distinct from horizontal philanthropy, which is given by one community for another community. So horizontal is people within the same community mobilizing resources, and this could be financial, material, in-kind, and voluntary time, as opposed to resources coming from outside of communities. So we can make this distinction by saying African philanthropy and philanthropy for Africa. And I think what's important to recognize, though, is that they're not in opposition, or it's not an either-or proposition, that the promotion of local resource mobilization does not exclude the value of external resources provided by other communities. It really only stresses that external resources should complement horizontal philanthropy, so that the efforts of community members are in a controlling position and assume leadership over how resources are used in the community. So as Very Nice says, we need top-down resources, but bottom-up ownership. Now, to get to the punchline, why do we need horizontal philanthropy? I've reflected on this and I've come up with 6 reasons. First, it's a sustainable type of development. Cloud Ake, who's a West African scholar, reminds us that for something to be sustainable, it has to be part of the everyday, it has to be embedded in our life. And these traditions of giving, of African giving, are something that we all know are very embedded in everyday life and culture of African society, so it's something that will endure. Secondly, we have to recognize that horizontal philanthropy is something of tremendous magnitude. It's too large to ignore. It's practiced by 1.2 billion people across the African continent. So people know something about how to get resources where they're needed most. Also, another reason why we need horizontal philanthropy is that it has the developmental impact. It's a way that people move out of poverty. So we come back to the example of educating children. And it's also a way that people can maintain their position in poverty when things are getting worse and pushing them further down. Often people talk about horizontal philanthropy as being survivalist, but in the context where poverty is getting worse and the economic situation is disastrous at times, standing still, survival, is actually really moving forward. And also, another thing about horizontal philanthropy, and the reason why we need it, is that it practices an asset-based approach to development. So instead of looking at what communities don't have, it focuses on assets and what communities do have. So it looks at local institutions, and it looks at the agency and the assets of people and communities. And by doing so, it gives them control and leadership. And finally, we moved away from looking at beneficiaries, what we often think of as the beneficiaries. We move towards them setting priorities and strategies and ways of working. And this is opposed to following the ways of working of the donor. And I think we're all very aware of how problematic a lot of international aid is. So to conclude, we need horizontal philanthropy because it offers us a mindset which is contrary to the top-down paradigm of much development assistance. And it also recognizes the existence of African philanthropy, that there is something there to build on. And we're not starting from scratch. Thank you.
So given the shortage of research and data in philanthropy for our continent, are there other ways of appreciating and generating knowledge and community memory in ways that are not limited to formal research processes and academia?
The theme of this panel is the need for philanthropy. Can you share with us what do you think are the major contradictions that trouble you in this debate? Thank you.
Are we talking about philanthropy for justice? Are we talking about philanthropy to enable freedom of decision making? Are we talking about philanthropy for agency? I think there are a range of things underneath what we're saying we're doing that we haven't interrogated enough and that we need to bring up instead. And I think that's one of the most important contradictions. As we're talking about this need for philanthropy, we're really not very explicit about what the need is meant to be for. Do we just want to continue having the creation of philanthropy so that we can continue addressing these small, unconnected objectives, or do we want a different kind of society? Do we want a different kind of society that enables people to make their own decisions? And I think if we want that, then we need to have a different kind of philanthropy, and we need to be asking ourselves, what are we need to be thinking about this differently? What's our practice need to be looking like?
You touched upon government and indeed the need for partnerships. In your experience, has government given the right signals to say that they need philanthropy?
Effort on the part of government and Treasury in particular to understand how philanthropy works and where there's space for partnership. And in other contexts as well, governments are coming to the table to say, how can we partner? I think where they're trying to bring philanthropy together and say, look, this is on our agenda, what's on your agenda as local philanthropy, as US philanthropy, as bilaterals operating in a country. I think that opens the space. I think it's always hard to negotiate because government has a set of priorities. Philanthropy, when we sit around the table, everyone has their own priorities and their own 5-year, 10-year plans. And so how to find common ground?
We have to go to the ground. We have to have different kinds of methods and ways of working. So we have to kind of get out of our academia and out of our silos of thinking to understand the ways in which people are giving in ways that are not siloed, in ways that are not about HIV or about education or about children. We really need to understand the reality and how that informs the everyday systems of mutuality and reciprocity and solidarity that's happening on the ground. And we can only do that by talking to people. So we need to stop talking to experts, I would say. We need to start understanding people from where they are rather than us thinking that we know better.